This is the Burn the Ladders podcast brought to you by OVR. The OVR Sprint is out now. There was an awesome thread yesterday on Twitter where a couple coaches who pre-ordered their units got those first shipments in this last week. One coach said he timed over 200 sprints consecutively I believe it was in a PE setting, and for the first time ever had no missed reps. He'd used all the other devices before out in the sun and had no missed reps. So if you haven't checked it out already, go check out the OVR Sprint, OVRperformance.com. As always, our devices are just have the living hell stress tested out of them. I personally have used the OVR Sprint for over 2 years in a high school setting with kids as young as second grade, as old as 20-somethings who are in the transfer portal coming back. It does not miss reps. It was built to handle the sun. It's powered on both sides. It's a really unique, easy device that was built with a coach's needs in mind. Use it with the app, which is free. Use it without the app because it's got screens on every device. And now into the podcast. Today we have
time out.
Yeah.
I want to know more about the OVR actually. I'm sorry
let's
to interrupt my podcast.
Let's do it.
Or your podcast. But what is the price point?
The price point is $229 per gate. So that each gate it's powered on both sides, so it's not a reflector-based system. So there's, one side goes on the left and the right. So when you look at a picture and you see two devices, that is one gate. So each pass through. The gates, they don't work as a start and an end. It's like a Lego set. Every single gate can be added. You can, start off with a start and finish gate as you like it, which hopefully you will. I anticipate that everyone will because I love them. Add in your split gates. You can do single passes for things like fly 10s. The app, if you put in the distance, will automatically convert your miles per hour. You can do multi-passes. In-beam starts are a breeze. You've got trigger starts. You've even got, if you turn on the trigger, the spectate mode, and the in-beam start, you can even get a full FAT-style track start, wherein the first split that would show up would be your reaction time of your hand or whatever piece of you that's in the in-beam start would come up. So you can actually have a coach trigger it, and every laser has a little beep function. So you can do some really cool stuff that only really comes not because competitors at our price point, which no one's at our price point, but not because, even competition, but just because as coaches, as people who train ourselves, our own curiosities, and this is one of the cool things about OVR, our own curiosities are what drive a lot of the innovation within the products. So, and then we have the best tripods in the world. They're super portable, collapsible. There's no little clamping mechanisms, and we've got quick release magnet mounts. So that when it's great to have all the lasers and everything, but when you set up, you've got to screw them in. You've got to unscrew them when you're done. Those screw threadings, depending on what kind of bag or whatever that you carry them around in. I happen to have a really cool coaching bag that hopefully we get out on the market soon. But putting the quick release magnets on it, you just screw them in one time to your gate, one time to your tripod, and now all of a sudden you can literally set up each gate in a matter of just a couple seconds. Mm-hmm. They're phenomenal. They have 10 channels, so you can run up to 10 independent lanes at once, put as many splits on each of those lanes as you want, and you've got the range to time clear from one side of the track to the other. And again, they've been battle tested in the Florida sun. Which is apparent. We're not going to tell you, don't wear white. We're not going to tell you that you have to run within this very narrow corridor. If you want to set up the gates clear across the track, widthwise, so that all 8 lanes are timing on the same gate, you can do that. Or if you want to set up 8 individual gates across the track, you can do that. So they allow you to do absolutely anything you'd want to do. Getting rave reviews already. They're super light, super cheap. I believe our 2-gate kit that comes with tripods and quick release mounts is right around that $499 or $498 mark. So you can get yourself going and then build out your kit from there. 60-day money back guarantees on everything. The
So
only
I have
issue
a
is that they
question,
sell out
Michael.
pretty quick. Yeah.
So it sounds like, like for one unit, you can be all in for about 500.
Yeah.
And a lot of sprint-based football teams want,
Hmm.
to expose their kids to max velocity twice a week, and they're
Right.
always asking like how do I do it with 60 guys? And I'm like,
Hmm.
okay. A lot of times they don't have any equipment, so I say, okay, you could have 3 groups of 20 and 3 coaches with a stopwatch and 3 coaches with a clipboard, and you could do it that way, divide and conquer. So if somebody wanted to do 3 groups of 20, let's say,
Hmm.
could they actually get that done with 3 of those $500 units?
Yes. And moreover than that, because every unit has all of our units, all the pieces of equipment that we make. And these are the types of things that if you ever have questions about any of our stuff, please reach out to me and I'll gladly sit down with you for as long as need be to talk about the equipment. That is my sort of role with all of this. But in addition to that, because personally, I work with very large groups, and we typically set up a sprint lane or two right outside of our weight room. And I talk to coaches across the country who use our stuff. And so some of them have brought up one thing that's really interesting, that for the setting that you're talking about in particular, our devices each have they each have a screen on them, and that screen has a 100 rep memory. So, and it's got 2 buttons, a left and a right button, which serve very conveniently. And as you would assume, if you're looking at them, your left thumb is scroll back, your right thumb is scroll forward. So if you're in a situation like a football practice, what I would do there, because I wouldn't want to be relying upon a tablet, although we do have them, or we've got our nice free app, which would catalog everything for you. But, when I've previously coached football teams, we always had kids, every day they started practice essentially in the same line.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got it structured, most coaches do things like that for attendance purposes, and just sort of, order out of chaos. If you know the order, your seniors are going to go first, and they're, who's going to be at the head of each line. I've talked to a couple coaches who what they do is basically waterfall their kids through. So they might be running fly 10s. And again, I'm big on rest. I know in your, in Feed the Cats and sprint-based football, you're not trying to just run your 2 attempts as fast as you can to get it over with. You're trying to do it to actually get that stimulus and have that rest. So a real quick and easy way to take that burden off of the coaches would be send your kids through, what order they're in, print out, on a clipboard or whatever, that's not going to have to worry about, the heat or something dying. Print out your roster, your however you divide up your kids into your 3 less lists with empty cells next to them. Print that out, have them run through in that order, and send them just every few seconds so that there's no waiting, and then wait until the round is done. And while they're resting and they're walking back and preparing for that second rep, now you as a coach can quite leisurely look through, scroll through, write those times down, and you don't have to wait until after practice, and you don't have to worry about if anything got missed. You can do it and see it right there. That way your eyes can also be up and you can be coaching rather than looking down at a screen. So yeah, we've, both consciously and inadvertently made something that can definitely be a tool to integrate into practice. And furthermore, you can time literally anything within practice. So whether you're applying sprint-based concepts or you're trying to, teach wide receiver breaks and agility concepts a la, Tony Villani or something, this is a hyper portable, super versatile tool that you can take out into the field with you, for integration, not just into workouts, but into actual sport practice.
Wow. One last question. I'm sorry to hog your time like this.
Yeah. No problem.
But one of the things that I liked about Freelap is that we run in twos a lot. We race, and that's typically not possible in any type of optical system. Is it possible in your system or no?
So
You don't like to race.
what you would have to do, because our system works on channels, so we have 10 channels. So you could run, you're going to need more units. So we're at the Freelap where you'd be doing it with just one cone or one, set of cones to get 2 kids racing. You would have to buy essentially duplicates of the kits. But again, if you're talking about getting 3 done, or 3 lanes done, you can be running each of them, simultaneously, because it is a different, because it's a channel system that you control. 10 channels. Our OVR jump device works the same way, by the way. It also has this 10 channel feature. So you can have, 10 stations. This also goes back to if you've got your DBs working on one drill over here and your wide receivers working on another drill over here, your defensive linemen, you can have, in summer workouts especially, the system shines, but you can have everyone working at independent stations, or you can pair those devices up in close proximity. I've used other devices in the past where, basically because they had short ranges, you could say have one group running on one sideline and another group running on the other sideline, and because they're spaced out far enough, there wouldn't be any interference. But with our system, they're actual designated channels, so you can have them, as close together as the track lanes are, and you're not going to get interference from one channel to another. So you can leverage that to have them both race side by side. That's what I do with my kids all the time. I've had, I'll take 60 kids through, split them up by, say, their fly 10 times, and have 4 lanes set up simultaneously. Run them all through, because that's when you're going to get the most PRs, is when they're, when they're sprinting, when you can spike that arousal and excitement and adrenaline, create some actual stakes, gamify your training. That's our big thing with OVR. So yeah, they're built to have fun.
Yep, sounds great.
And yeah, at a price point where, if you're a remote coach, or you have some other system, we're going to be at the Universal Speed Rating, their Speed Lab Summit in a couple weeks. If you are in a situation where you're trying to get people outside of your walls sprinting, you're trying to get them working on, duplicating essentially your training styles, you're trying to scale your own business as a consultant. All of our products are also built with that in mind. It lowers that sort of peripheral cost and point of entry, and allows everyone to have sort of common standards, and common, setup protocols.
I love it.
So, all right. So, with all that said, and we can bring up, I'll answer whatever other questions you have as they come along. But first, let's get your name out of the way first. I'm here today with my new friend here, Tony Holler, whom I first started hearing about as I got into coaching in the high school, right around the time of COVID. I started hearing about Feed the Cats, and I think very early on, it was actually one of our young football coaches who now is not quite so young, who asked me if I had heard about you, and he just sort of pointed out some similarities and some the way that we kind of talked about some things. Um, and so very quickly you became someone that every time I, saw your name on a podcast, whether I knew much about that podcast or not, I go, I like the way that this guy frames ideas. Um, and so at some point you're somebody that I wanted to talk to. Um, and you've gone through a lot of your sort of history and backstory. I know every time like I do a podcast, the first like half of it is, like how'd you get here and stuff. And um, so I'm going to say, like if you want to hear more about Tony, he's done a million podcasts. Listen to them. I'm now going to selfishly start asking a lot of the questions that I want to ask, and they'll allow you to touch on some of that stuff along the way. Um, but the first thing, I guess that I want to ask, because it is something that you always sort of you talk about when you're telling your story, that as you start to sort of make that transition from the old school sort of typical kind of coach where work is good and all work is good, sweat is good, effort, it just visible, perceptible uh, effort and strain, where that's all good. As you start to implement those early days of what would become sort of feed the cats, how quickly, I'm always interested in this. I had a conversation years ago with Nate Harvey, um, who wrote Conjugate U. But anytime you put in a like radically sort of different system, anytime you make a big change like that, how quickly did you start to see the effects of buy-in and sort of the growth of your program as you switched? And was there um, how much sort of like reprogramming of your athletes and I guess the coaches around you, like what's that transition process actually like?
Well, that's a really cool
Or what was
question.
it like the first time you went through it?
Yep.
Because now now you've got answers.
Yeah. It, it all, every situation depends on your setting, your place and time and all that kind of stuff. And because I was a relatively small school track coach, and I say that track is a stepchild in the sports world. I only coach orphans because the parents don't even come to the damn meets. So these kids might as well not even have parents. Uh, and so it's really a sport that is kind of a cult sport where only the people who are immersed in it give a rat's ass whether but for those people it's a great sport. So so my results were immediate, and I really believe, I don't know if I've ever said this before, it had as much to do with what we stopped doing as what we started doing.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of my slides is stop doing shit that makes you slow. I mean, and I think that coaches do a lot of shit that makes kids slow. Now, Steve Magnus, the miler endurance guy who was the brilliant and a great writer and all that stuff, he would argue, he would plant his flag on the hill that endurance work does not make you slow. But endurance work will make you slow. You won't jump as high. You won't throw as far. You won't lift as heavy. You won't bounce as well. He is just totally wrong, even though he's right about everything else. So we stop doing all the dumb stuff. And the first thing that happens when you stop doing all that stuff, your practices get really short because
Mm-hmm.
you realize almost everything you did in practice was dumber than hell. I mean, like, what was I thinking? If we could argue 14 of the 18 track events in the state of Illinois are sprint based events. They are speed based. The faster you are, the better you are. And you could even argue that the 4 distance races, it doesn't hurt you to get faster.
Hmm.
So why was I in this? I think it's because one of the 2 magazines I got throughout the 80s and 90s were Runner's World magazine. I mean, that was the science that I was like feeding myself, that and muscle and fitness. No wonder we were all screwed up, right? But that was the deal. So when we stopped doing dumb stuff and started doing the right stuff and started measuring it, I just saw explosions. I mean, I
Hmm.
did it really to attract athletes to my track program, and that worked. But what I didn't realize was that by doing far, far less and doing it in a gamified way, the average kids, the kids that you didn't even care whether or not they came out for your track team, those kids improved the most. And some of them became pretty damn good. So the results were really crazy. And one last thing about that is that, once again, time and space. This was 1999. I had no free reach back then. I think I have 250,000 followers across like 6 platforms right now. I didn't have any followers back then. If I discovered something, I could not, like shout. Maybe I could shout from a rooftop, but nobody would hear it. Whereas
Hmm.
in today's world, we have podcasts and we can write stuff and publish it ourselves and all that. So yeah, all that stuff was looking back. You can probably tell I'm excited talking about it. That I just found something that worked.
Hmm.
Now, if I
Did you?
time and place, I will add, if I was a head football coach, all that would have been different because
Hmm.
now you got every parent bitching that their kids aren't getting worked hard enough. You have athletes that are like, Coach, how come we're not working like Walter Payton used to work? And how come we're not like sprinting up sand dunes and things like that? So it would have been much different. So, but because of my time and place, I got a free pass.
Hmm. Um, so, like one of the early teams that I started working with was a wrestling team,
Mm.
and I the sort of things that among the coaches in my school that I'm known for, and I don't coach every sport. I work with like 9 of them right now. Um, but one of the things that always sort of provides a lot of skepticism from the coaches is that even say with my wrestlers, we did no we do nothing that looks to the observer to be conditioning. We do a lot of work, but there's no road work. There's very little. I try to get them sprinting, and my wrestlers are surprisingly fast. They jump very well, especially considering that they are in uh, wrestling is a brutal sport to work with because um, you know they can very quickly get involved in matches that are 5-10 minutes of just straight grinding, where it goes well past anything explosive. So they do have to have gas tanks, and they do have to quote unquote be conditioned, and yet when people look at my programming, they don't see any conditioning. um, and our wrestlers are, I would say, very well conditioned. But in those first couple years, I our coach sort of got on board with things very quickly. But I still had kids who
Mhm.
wanted to, they wanted to go later and go home, and they wanted to, have their Rocky montage in their neighborhood of, running or wearing the trash bag or, um, I think I'm past and sort of I'm in my 5th year now at this school, and I think I've kind of cycled out of any generation of that. But did you have any sort of with track, especially, like did you have any early struggles with like the kids who are in track, basically, because they like to run, not to sprint, but the kids who like to run, the more sort of cross country minded kids.
Not as many as you would think. And I'll go back to that football reference. I would have had 100 times more
Hmm.
situations like that in football. But in track, I'd had some success. I already won a state championship doing it dumb things. But I was persuasive. I think that any coach that cannot persuade a teenager that his ideas are right, maybe your ideas are not right. You know what I'm saying? I'm like, there's two ways to coach. There's two ways to coach. One is my way or the highway.
Hmm.
Either do it or I'm kicking your ass off the team. Get with the program, young man, which is probably the way I was coached. Maybe you were coached. Or there's the
Hmm.
persuasive analytical coach, which is more like I am. I'm emotional, but I'm hopefully persuasive, and I can. And if I cannot persuade a kid, that's on me. Now, in
Hmm.
the 5th year of Feed the Cats, I had a 47-second 400-meter runner. Now, the year before I got there, he ran 51 as a sophomore, and I asked him. I said, John, what were your sprint times? He goes, Coach, I'm a middle distance runner. I go, no, you're
Hmm.
not. A 400 guy is a sprinter. He goes, well, it depends how you look at it. So I already knew that, this guy was kind of hard headed and stubborn, but he's my best athlete as well. So I said, we're going to train you different this year. So we trained him like a cat. He ran sub 11 in the 100, he ran sub 22 in the 200, and he ran 47 in the 400. So he started calling himself White Lightning. He was fast. He was Tennessee fast. And
Hmm.
but then at the state meet, he had a disappointing third place finish, and he had chased a guy that was better than him, and he faded at the end, and it looked like he was out of shape.
Hmm.
And so his parents didn't speak to me for 3 months, and he didn't speak to me either. And I knew something was up, and so sure enough, they wanted his AAU coach to train him the next year because the AAU coach copied Clyde Hart, the guy that coached
Hmm.
4 or 5 Olympians. And how many Olympians have you coached, Coach Holler? I'm like, okay, none. I never will, probably. But so they did it. They did it the old way, and he never broke 50 his senior year.
Hmm.
Now I still love the kid, and he had a good college career and all that kind of stuff. I'm just saying that, to your question, I had one kid that fought it. He just didn't feel like he was working hard enough, and it's intuitive. If a kid does not finish the race well, it must be conditioning.
Hmm.
But what I'd like to say is, look who's broke the 400-meter record, Van Niekerk. He ran the first half of his race in 20.50. 20.50 is like the greatest first 200 in the history of the 400. That means he could probably run a 1950, a 19.50 in the open 200. That's how fast he ran the first half. He ran one of the slowest final hundreds in the history of elite 400. He ran a 12:05 and died at the end, but still ran 43:03, which is still the world record in lane 8, meaning that the 400 is a sprint,
Hmm.
and you nobody is fresh and fast at the end. It hurts no matter how many miles you've run, no matter how many Clyde Hart workouts you've done. The 400 never becomes easy, and you're never fastest at the end of the race. So anyway, I'm getting better at persuading, but I don't think I could have persuaded that kid and his parents in 2005, no matter what I said.
Yeah. Well, there's always parents are an especially uh, spicy wrinkle because even when you do persuade the kid, uh,
Yeah.
often often the kid knows what's right, but the kid also doesn't want to. Kids don't ultimately they don't want to disappoint anyone, which is perhaps a coach's most powerful weapon. Uh,
Mhm.
but it's also something that everyone else in their life is trying to weaponize against them too. So I often see that phenomenon of, um, you know, it always scares the hell out of me when like a middle schooler will get dropped off with me and the parent says, I'll have this thing happen where a parent says, well, he's got my genetics, so sorry. They kind of make a self-deprecating comment, but they're saying it about themselves, but they're also telling you what they expect out of their kid. And and they'll say, like, if you can just give them a good workout. And I'll kind of smile and go, well, that's not, you're going to leave. So I'm not going to have the conversation with you about like, I want this kid actually smiling and having fun. And I want them to, we're going to measure everything. Like I want them to see how big and strong and fast they're getting and feel more confident about themselves. But like clockwork, if that kid just simply shows up, then in 2 or 3 years, there's going to come a point where that kid that they were looking at and saying like, he's a reflection of me and my sport career didn't go so great. Like I didn't, a lot of the parents now, they're my age or just a little older. They grew up with that idea of like the 80s jock who kind of bullied everyone else. And you can tell like they didn't sit in their head, they don't sit at the table with the jocks. They sit on a nearby table where they just don't want to get picked on by the jock. And they think that their biggest fear is that their kid is going to end up sort of one table further away where they're like the prey in the lunchroom. And they don't have any actual hope of their kid migrating across the cafeteria to the jock table. They just want to get him. Can you get him kind of into the safe middle where like he can make the team, but he doesn't get made fun of. He's just good enough not to be embarrassing, but they have no actual expectation for him to progress further. And then something like clockwork will happen. The kid will go to a camp and run just fast enough or throw just fast enough. Something will happen where one of the, a travel parent or an AAU parent that they see every year at every meet, every showcase, whatever, will turn to them and go, yeah, some kid you got there. Little Johnny here, he's got my genetics. And they'll realize, oh no, wait a second, I've got a good boy. I've got one of those good boys that all the other dads compare their sons to. And simultaneously, I believe they don't actually buy into their kids' potential. But they realize that there's this moment now where like they have sort of that child that they perhaps like fantasized about having. And they don't really believe in it. So they don't like trust the process to just continue and develop. And, kid runs a 47. If we just let this cook, maybe next year he comes back and runs 45, 46. I'm at a school where we had a kid run like 45.99 a couple of years ago. He ran the NCAA lead this past year. But there was a period where he was trying to break into the 46s. And, I had a conversation with a coach back then saying, like, he's going to need to run at least a 10.6. And they were like, but is it, no, he needs to be more conditioned. I said, no, he's not fast enough. Like, you can't be conditioned. You can't condition yourself to redline the whole way. You've got to increase the limit. So, just like the Van Niekerk race, like you're going to be tired at the end. This all ties together in my head. But you have those parents where their kid starts to get onto the precipice of really being a stud. And they've never believed in it. And the moment they see it, they go, oh, well, now I'm going to enjoy this moment. And we're going to get more coaches, more cooks in the kitchen. And what happens like clockwork, it's usually their junior year. And the most tragic thing in the world is what's coming. Because like I tell my kids all the time, and I'll tell their parents if they, ever speak to me, like they're that's the first son you've ever had. It's not the first son I've ever seen. You're the first you've ever been. You're not the first you I've ever met. Like I, you're just this year's, you're like a new model of a car. You're this year's, Ford Focus. But by the time the kid has that regression, there's no time on the other side of it. Especially for guys, when it happens their junior to senior year. I look at combine data all the time, huge data sets, 16,000 kids from this year, 13,000 from this year. And I'll just look at like the average 40 time even. And the kids get slower on average from junior to senior year. And I'll go back and I'll look on Mile Split or, the Athletic or athletic.net or something. And I'll do the same thing, pull all the data from get a few thousand kids in, and then look and go, the juniors are a little faster than the seniors. And then every team that I'm ever around, there's always a freshman who shocks everyone. He has a pretty good sophomore year. He doesn't really improve much his junior year. Maybe he gets hurt. And then his senior year, they all talk about what a good kid he used to be and how he got like early senioritis. Meanwhile, the kid is complaining about like, I physically hurt. Mm-hmm. And, that revelation of like, well, he's just further from puberty now. So he can't recover from the volume that you've been throwing at him. And so now suddenly you don't see his potential anymore. He's regressing and there's no time left. And his attitude is suffering. It's like, yeah, because he's in physical pain in addition to the disappointment of not, all he's done his whole life is just get better every year. And to me, that's what sports are supposed to be about, is learning how to basically like deal with failure and your own mortality. And like as coaches, we should be guiding them through that. And instead, we're running them into it with no strategies to get out. And then blaming the kids when it's like every year you've got that same kid. Every year you've got the senior who, man, they were great for 3 years. Great attitude. They did everything that I ever wanted. And now their senior year, they don't listen to me, or their senior year, they have complaints, rather than looking at it as like, maybe I should listen to them because for 3 years they did everything I asked them to do. And now they're showing signs of breaking down. Maybe I should be talking to them about, when did this start happen? Why? Like, how did this feel? Or just time everything, and the time will tell you. So sort of along those kind of roads, with the sprint-based football, when did that really start to take hold, and what have been your best strategies for, I guess for just how do you initiate those conversations, or early on, again, before you were a 250,000 followers, as you were sort of building your rep? How did you first start making headway in talking to football coaches?
Not very well. I was highly unsuccessful. I was, I was an offensive coordinator, my head coach's right-hand man. And, we would do a 40-minute warm-up that included stations. And it was fatigue-seeking, total BS that absolutely did nothing but got us in a fatigue state before we actually started playing football. And, I saw a problem with that. I saw a problem with, like, hey, that team scored 30 on us Friday night. We're going to run 30 hundreds on Monday. I'm like, that pretty much ruins the entire week. You just burnt the steak on Monday, and we have stuff to correct. But, like, coaches are always, football coaches especially, want to default to really, really low-hanging fruit after every loss. They want it more than we did. They're in better shape than we were. We're soft. Those are the three favorite reasons for losses, not the 5 turnovers, not the 13 missed tackles. They really want to default to this BS way of thinking. And so I went through all that. And I was a football coach for 25 years. The most success I had was when I could run my own team, my freshman team. And we won 39 in a row over a 4 or 5 year stretch. And, with all different players every year. And we did no traditional conditioning, even though our kids were very conditioned to play in a game. I hate the word conditioning because when I think of conditioning, I think of the crap we do at the end of practice that has no reason to do this stuff except for to get really tired, thinking that helps us to play faster or better or longer come game time. So we did none of that stuff. Our practices were 90 minutes. We really, really worked on the things that win games. And if it didn't win games, we didn't do it. We timed sprints in the summer, all that kind of stuff. So I had started building this freshman football, sprint-based football model. And eventually, because we'd won 39 in a row, the head coach demoted me to assistant sophomore coach because there was a little bit too much vibe going on with the freshman program. And those 9-0 teams were not going 9-0 as seniors. And so I spent 1 year working with a guy that was half my age, and I didn't agree with a lot of this stuff. So I resigned. And, there was no, like, hey, we want you to stay, or no way. The head coach is very happy that I was leaving. And so this is kind of a funny story. Like late July, the next summer, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't preparing for football. So I wrote an article, New Ideas for Old School Football Coaches. I think it was in 2017, maybe, or 2018. And in that article, I basically, is my manifesto, the way things should be, but will never be. I said, football coaches will never time sprints twice a week in season. That will never happen because they don't want to know how slow their team has become. They don't want that information because if they had the information that their team is like 1 mile an hour slower than they were in the summer, then they would have to say, what in the hell am I doing to these kids? And they don't want to look in the mirror and say, damn, I was wrong. Nobody wants to do that. So what happened was a couple small school football coaches, Rick Aaron at Lena Winslow High School, Brad Dixon at Camp Point Central, started doing my stuff. They got rid of conditioning. They started sprinting twice a week, practice shorter. They started doing RPR as a, I don't think it was, I think it had become RPR by then. It was be activated before that. And they started trying to be fresh on game day instead of in shape. And what they found was their team were faster. They won all their games. The games were usually over at halftime. Nobody ever got hurt. It's like their injury rate like disappeared. Even concussions, because I really believe that fatigue is the reason for 90% of all injuries. I think GPS is showing us that. And even the injuries like concussions and ACL and things, it's the body's inability to protect itself. That a fresh, fast, healthy body typically does not get hurt. But a slow, fatigued, unhealthy body, that's an injury waiting to happen. So all these things started going on. And then all of a sudden, I was writing more and more because people were fueling my fire. And then a Division III coach out in Virginia started doing it. Pedro Aruza, Randolph-Macon College. If you haven't heard the podcast I did with Pedro, and people need to look it up, sprint-based podcast, Pedro Aruza, Randolph-Macon. They are 57-7 since they started doing this stuff. 57-7. And people start taking note. And then on the podcast, he said, Coach, my first 4 practices, we go 60 minutes, 60 minutes, 60 minutes, then a day off. That's blasphemy, right? There are coaches that burst into flames when they heard that. Like, I bet they're soft. I bet they're soft. Oh, wait, they are 57-7. Hey, coach, is your team soft? We are violent. I mean, sprint-based football coaches will fight you. They say, we are violent on defense. We are not soft. Like Lombardi said that fatigue makes cowards of us all. He's right.
Mm-hmm.
So try not to get your kids so tired. So anyway, that's how it all kind of got working. And I think that results, people start taking notice, and I think that the football coaches almost become culty in this, it's kind of obnoxious because they'll fight like hell for these ideas now because it's so good for kids and they feel reborn as coaches. And it's kind of like, when you are reborn, you want to tell people. And those people are kind of obnoxious sometimes because they're a little too much of an advocate for their beliefs and things. But let's just say there's a lot of people out there preaching, and they don't have to be preaching because their own team is very, very good, and they're in their own little world, everything's great. But they want other coaches and other kids to go through this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so many things there again that I just love hearing. One of the things that I've heard you say before that I think is one of like the more profound sort of shifts of perspective, that to me is sort of like oddly reminiscent. I always say like when things are true, they repeat. Years ago, I got a phone call, probably like 4 or 5 years ago now. I got a phone call from someone. They hit me up on Instagram, because of West Side versus the World. I have a lot of like strength enthusiasts and powerlifting enthusiasts, and probably my biggest market for that movie was strength coaches. So I have a lot of people that even before my content started to turn more to coaching and performance, even before OVR, I have a lot of people that I've talked to or I've just, seen that they like or comment for a decade. And eventually we end up having conversations. One of these accounts that reached out to me a few years ago, and it was a very profound conversation, was this young kid called me up, Zach Goodman, who I believe you've talked to.
I think so. Yeah, it rings a bell.
Yeah. But Zach is like a 21-year-old, called me up and said, as I love saying, like, when things are true, they repeat. Math is math. It's constant across the board. That's what makes training, predictable. Training is cooking. Cooking is chemistry. Chemistry is just math. I'm also renowned as.
Is that a quote that you've said? Say that again. That is so quotable.
Training. I was going to say I just say things. Training is cooking. Cooking is chemistry, and chemistry is math. And I say all of this as I went to film school. I used to live in LA, and I'm a published author and a filmmaker, TV producer. That's the trade that I was actually educated for, and yet I'm also renowned for saying there's no such thing as art. There is only math. You only see the seams in art. Things only appear formulaic when the math doesn't line up. When the ending, when the solution is forced upon the equation and not earned through it. That's when you're writing something, what you are intending to do, and you're hoping that the math of the language is itself. It's just math. You're hoping that this math adds up to the emotional or logical response that you want. That's what persuasion is. That's what storytelling is. Storytelling is just an analysis, a reconciliation of cause and effect over time, which is the same thing that training is, and the same thing that cooking, like it's all the same thing. We divide things arbitrarily through language, but so Zach Goodman called me up and he said, I've been looking at your stuff as you talk about. I think at the time I was talking about that we jumped basically every day, and we would sprint. At the time, I think I wasn't like posting much about it, but I think we were basically doing fly 10s with a 30-yard lead or longer sometimes, depending upon how fast a kid was. At least once a week, aiming for 2 times a week, weather permitting. And then the facility that we had enough room that we could always run sort of like starting 10s inside. So I had this like 120-foot narrow turf strip. So we would always get 2 accelerations each week. And what I wanted was to get 2 accelerations each, or 2 days of accelerations, 2 days of max velocity. But every day we would jump, and it was relatively low volume. It would be like, I started calling it like 4-4. We would do 4 dumbbell jumps, 4 standing verticals, each with 30 to 60 seconds of rest. Louis, who I lifted many of my ideas and sort of grounding like philosophies from, Louis would talk about doing 80 jumps a week divided up into 2 workouts. And because of simply numbers and only having so many devices, I was like, well, we're going to pepper this in as just like 8 jumps, essentially 4 times a week. And that's going to get us, it's not going to get us all the way there, but we're measuring each jump. So it's more intensive simply because the kid can, the kid's going to try something. He's going to see, oh, I jumped a little higher. I'm going to lean into that. Or I didn't jump as well. I'm going to try something a little different. So it amplified the intensification of it. And I was like, so that'll get us through the fact that we do less. And he's like, the way that you talk about jumping, that sounds like feed the cats and, doing these max velocity flies, frequently, low volume, just, hitting them as much as you can, recording it, creating that intensification. And then he said, and then, you've got a guy like Jared Bidney who I would definitely be lumped more into like a strength emphasis and sort of perspective in terms of how I look at training. But again, everything is so nebulous to me that it's all just math. It doesn't really matter. They're just outputs to me. But a guy like Jared Bidney, where he squats and benches 3 times a week, incredibly heavy, and he's only focused on 40s, but very, very fast kids who jump incredibly high. And him talking about our volumes are very low. Our frequency is much higher than most people are comfortable with. And the intensity, so it's, we have super high frequency, super high intensity, super low volume. And he's like, then when you talk about jumps, it's super high frequency, super high intensity, super low volume. And then Tony talking about sprints, it's super high. And, basically you can have 2 of those high, one of them has to be low. So that's not actually what I wanted to talk about, but for some reason I wanted to say that. But the more sort of profound thing, I guess this is it. I've heard you say before, like that concept of like, your hardest days are going to be the meets.
Oh, yeah.
And, so this is where I was going, and things, if they're true, they repeat. So I'm also friends with like Dave Hoff, biggest powerlifting total, not just the biggest powerlifting total. I don't think people fully understand Dave Hoff's sort of like legacy and achievements, but he has something like 18 of the 20 biggest powerlifting totals, or 18 of the 25 biggest powerlifting totals of all time. He's one of the most dominant athletes at his sport ever. And I've seen him train, and for a multiply powerlifter, so you'd think like the exact opposite end of the spectrum, his meet days are the most devastating days to his body.
Oh, wow.
By far. And like for powerlifters, just period, that is a common concept. You cannot make your training more brutal than, than the warm up and then 3 competition attempts of, an 1,100, 1,200, and 1,300 pound squat back to back to back with, 10 minutes in between, followed by 1,000, 1,050, 1,100 pound bench attempt, followed by, let's just throw in a few 800 or 900 pound deadlifts. You can't do that at any other point in training. You would suffer serious medical health crisis if you even came close to attempting to do that. You can sometimes, you pick your spots to sort of chase a true representation of one of those outputs every now and then. But even then, you're splitting it up, and the rest of your workout acknowledges that, where it might be like, I'm going to take my opener and I'm going to do like 1 week accessory and get out. So there's this sort of common thing of just like letting go of that idea of like, we're going to make practice harder. We can't. To see Van Niekerk run that world record where he's dying down the stretch, you could make practice harder, but he wouldn't be standing atop that podium.
Nope. He wouldn't run a 20.50 in the first 200 if he conditioned to be stronger or fresher at the end,
Yeah. Similarly, my first job, I worked for the NFL Network in like 2010, 2011, 2012, somewhere in there. And the very first assignment I ever had was they were like onboarding me and just teaching me systems, was I was like cataloging the live feeds of practice. And it's one of the, it was supposed to be like a rite of passage type, thing, almost like hazing. But I was also, I was an editor there, and most of the editors don't really care about sports. I was an anomaly to look like a football player and work in the dark edit bay. But I would watch and you watch sort of the very languid pace of like their warm-ups and how easy and this the highest level of football, and guys who are so detailed, and as I've gotten older to know as well that like most of these guys are significantly slower than you really think. They're just so focused and so well at, they're tactically and technically and skill wise, they're so good. And they're so tuned in, and yet you watch their practices, and it's like the lower you get in football, the more yelling there is. The lower you get in football, the more work there is. And you look at an NFL practice where they're walking around, and they're having these just room-level casual conversations in between everything. And you listen to like Tom Brady talk about all the interviews he does now, and he's telling his story and saying, well, as the 4th string quarterback, I'd only get 2 reps. And he'd say, and the starter would only get 20. And you go like, wow, those are billion-dollar franchises. And, he was talking about Michigan at the time, but it's like when you get to the NFL, it's even less. It's, so the starter is going to get the guy whom tens of millions of dollars in any given week is dependent upon. They're only going to trot him out 20 times that day. Mm-hmm. Half of those he's going to hand the ball off. And you ask like, well, why don't you do more? And they go, well, we don't want to break the resource. We have to save the resource for the game. Oh, but they're going to do so much more in the game. Aren't you worried? And they're like, I'm worried about getting them to the game in the highest level of working order. And so we're going to spend a lot more time in meetings. We're going to spend a lot more time in air conditioning. We're going to spend a lot more time sitting down and everyone's cozy in their hoodies. and it's again to hear you talk about integrating these concepts like largely at lower levels, high school, sort of where everything's, the biggest epidemic within coaching. Um, and to say something as profane as your meet should be the hardest day, when you turn around and look and you go like, well, the highest levels of sport, game day is the hardest day. And having the highest, it's the hardest day because you have the highest performance. And in order to have a performance that is higher on those days, you have to hold back. But then simultaneously that opens up the time to like go actually do film study. You actually talk to your kids and figure out, what does Johnny know? What does he not know? What's going to scare the crap out of him on Friday night? What's going to cause him to miss the tackle on Friday night? What does he not know? What's going to confuse him and lead to the coverage breakdown that gets him yelled at and gets you booed from, mom and dad up in the stands? You saying it was one of the first times that I heard someone like actually just full-throatedly articulate that and own it. And it was, again, relatively early as I was working in high schools to go like, that's such a scary concept, especially to football coaches.
It's blasphemy, right? It's
Yeah.
blasphemy. It like goes against our religion, and
Mm-hmm.
football really becomes a religion. We inherit our beliefs, like like the religion that you practice is probably the religion of your parents. The political party of your parents are probably your political party. The way you were coached is the way you coach, and being a coach's kid, I think, made me weird and unique.
Yeah.
47.
That's another thing.
Yeah,
How is your father like,
yeah.
in terms of, because I see largely two types of people, and so in terms of coaching, I interact with largely two types of coaches. There are sort of like the people who are pacified by the certainty of ritual and tradition,
Mhm.
that it outlines what their day is going to be, and they can, they wake up, they like to clock in and clock out of the same job, do the same things, eat the same lunch, and they like that their practice in front of them reminds them of the practice that they went through, and they like that they're on the other side of the power dynamic. And then the coaches who, are the black sheep are the ones who come in and go like, okay, so this is a starting point, and now I want to learn, and I want to learn like the ones who are driven by that curiosity. So to be a coach is like to start sort of in the traditional space and be a coach's kid. You have that added, um, you have that added identity crisis of like, what were my parents? So was your dad more of a curiosity driven coach or like a fundamentalist ritualistic coach?
That I love talking about dad. 47 years, 44 as a head coach, high school and college. So he wasn't
Mhm.
like one of these like freshman coaches that kind of like go home and not think about. No, no, he was totally obsessed, and he came from a bad home life where his only important male elder in his life was his basketball coach. So it was almost like he was a coach's kid too. And so
Mhm.
dad was we are all mixtures of traditional and new school. I like to think I'm all new school, but man, I can really get pissed off like the old school coaches can. Like I can go from A to Z and embarrass myself with a profane tirade. Anyway, we are all mixtures. He was a mixture, and this is a beautiful thing. I think he used to say, "We're going to practice so hard that games are easy."
Mhm.
That's the old school, but he could flip that switch and go new school. I'll never forget we had been upset before Christmas. My junior year, we had a great team. It was one of our three losses. and and we were going. It had the revenge game coming up. Revenge game on Friday. By God, it's at home. You can just imagine. We were like, this is the week. This is the week. Dad called us in and said, guys, we got a big game this week. We went, no shit. And he goes, we're only going to practice 60 minutes. 60 minutes all week. And we're not going to do any conditioning. No suicides, no killers, nothing at the end of practice. And we all looked at each other like, what the hell? I mean, because that wasn't what we were used to. And he said, but I'm going to ask one thing. I want you to perform every day in practice. I want you to compete like you've never competed before. Like we were diving on loose balls. We were taking charges. There were like fisticuffs break out. And we went out and won that game by 30 points on Friday night. A team that had beaten us early. On the way home, Dad was like feeling great. He says, hey, it worked, didn't it? I go, why in the hell don't we practice like that all the time?
Mm-hmm.
Mic drop,
Yeah.
right? So 2 of my 10 pillars in Feed the Cats: let the games be hard and make practice the best part of a kid's day. Those 2 things are pillars of mine now. And so I've actually taken that conversation on the ride home from a game when Dad was full of himself and I chopped him off at the knees saying we should be doing this all the time. And I said, let's do this all the time. And if you think about it, I can give you, we were talking about 400-meter training earlier. Our biggest workout is 3 times 200 with a 4-minute rest. Spiked up, add up the 3 times, take it times 0.67, add 2. That's their 4x4 predictor. That's it. They say, well, you mean you never run a lap in practice? I go, no, not my sprinters, ever. But how do they run a lap in a track meet? I go, oh, they do. They do. And they
Just keep going.
They are so ready. Just keep going. It's going to hurt like hell, but there's nothing I can do to make it feel fresh and easy at the end unless I tell you to slow down. And we ain't going to do that. If you think, as you're talking, I was thinking about marathon runners, maybe the exception, where we got to make practice harder than the race. No. Marathon runners, I've run 4. My longest run in training was 20 miles. I did that one time. One 20-mile run, one 18-mile run, one 17, one 16. And they were always bracketed by days off. The day before we took off, the day after we took off. That is how you train for a marathon. Now, some football coaches that we both know, if they were training kids for a marathon, first day, 26 miles, second day, 30, next day, 34. Next day, all the kids come in limping. So, oh, you guys are so soft. We are going to run 50 miles a day. And they're all hurt. They're quitting the team. So we let the marathon be hard. And I've never heard the powerlifting story. So that kind of, that truth, is repeated, right?
Yeah. Well, so like a couple things that I think I just want to say in front of you. So one of the things that I like to do anytime I start with a new coach is I like to ask them, like, who's the toughest kid on your team? I like to ask these 2 questions and space them out because I want their like real honest answer. I want the answer when they're not like trying to impress me, but when they're hopefully just contemplating it like relatively fresh and without a filter up. But I like to, like, maybe in the middle of practice, something would like you see a kid make a coach smile doing something that impresses him from like a work ethic kind of just a grit and moxie standpoint. And like, who's your toughest kid? And they'll go, oh, that one. That one is always short, slow, has trouble getting on the field. And you know why he's the toughest is because every time he gets knocked down, he stands back up. Everyone knows this kid's got no shot at college. This kid, like, there's no exterior incentive for this kid. This kid is not rewarded by the environment of, say in this case, football. I coached one year where, everyone said the same, you could line up 12 coaches and say, who's the toughest kid? And they would all say the same kid. And if a few days later you said, they're watching, after a loss or something, you say like, who's the softest kid? They would all say the same kid. Now, the softest kid goes to the highest profile school. I've had 2 cases where the softest kid wins the state championship. The softest kid sets the state record. The softest kid, in one case, softest kid is, I don't want to call the kid out, but I've talked about him many times on here. I have up on the wall behind me, like, this is a kid who got drafted by the Marlins recently. This girl was all region around this room. Normally I'm a little less lazy. I would have had one of my track kids here. But in order to get in one of these cases around this room is you have to be either state or national champion, all an all region player of the year. This kid, by the rules of the room, shouldn't even be here. But I went to one of his college games and he hit, I think, 2 home runs. And I said, like, to one of my coaches who was sitting next to me, we're watching him play, and then he got drafted by the Marlins. So he's like one of the best kids, talent-wise, that I've coached. But he wasn't a state champion, wasn't an all-region player. So he's the exception. But I have multiple jerseys in this room where their coach, a year or 2 before said, that's the softest kid in the program. And yet, that's the kid that, when playoffs happen, that's the kid that everyone leaned on. And in every instance, the kid who's the toughest kid, you don't get tough from winning. You get tough from losing and returning. So it's like, toughest, by far the toughest kids collectively that I've ever worked with were on the worst teams. The teams who showed up and had no shot. And, even, again, when things are true, they repeat. There's a reason why stories about, like, the Spartans and the 300, there's a reason why that sticks in our, sticks with popular culture thousands of years later. We don't talk about the winner. The movies paint, Xerxes and the Persians as soft. They decimated them. They killed all of them. They were the victors. They wore them down to literal death, and yet history portrays them as soft. So even winning doesn't make you, in a historical sense, doesn't even guarantee toughness. The Alamo, we hold losers up as, tough guys lose a lot. That's how you get so tough. So I wanted to say that about, I love to ask coaches, who's your toughest kid? Who's your softest kid? It's always that the softest kid is much better than the toughest kid. And, which is to that feed the cat's point. Gosh, there was something else that I was going to say that I've distracted myself with. But yeah, that just, that whole idea of, the slight to the ego of letting go of ideas like toughness, to say, we're going to practice so hard. I think that there's a very easy language fix to that concept, which is we're going to prepare so hard. Mm-hmm. We're going to prepare. Well, man, y'all are going to, we're going to be able to call up everyone to the whiteboard and everyone's going to know their block. Everyone's going to know their adjustment. We're going to prepare so hard. We're going to double down on our film time this week. We're not even going to touch the practice field. We're going to come in there so sharp. The dividends that that type of approach would pay, but that requires like actual discipline and toughness on the part of coaches to like look in the mirror and self-assess uh and to first like take that ownership of like it's never on the kids. It's I'm, like the kids are just a reflection of the preparation I set out for them. And like if you start from that sort of perspective, you can't help but embrace these kinds of concepts because you're just constantly looking for like how can I fail them less. So I guess to that point, or just sort of transitioning on, um, when looking at again, I sort of stumbled into a lot of Feed the Cats esque. Oh no, I'm going to go back because I do remember what I wanted to talk about, and it's the comparison of track and powerlifting.
Oh.
Again, being someone who has associations with Westside Barbell, and interacts with, in this case, I interact with a lot of track coaches, and they will often say things to me about, well, that West Side stuff, and they have no idea what that means, but their association is that powerlifting and West Side, that sounds like steroids, right? And the sort of funny thing being that like steroids, their sort of principal benefit that allows all of the downstream effects is that they aid in recovery.
Mm-hmm.
So you can do more work you can work harder if you're on steroids. It and you can work dumber because you can just fit more in your, it's just having a bigger bag at the grocery store. You can just fit more in. You don't have to budget. But everyone's afraid from the strength perspective of steroids, and they'll look, say, at like at a Charlie Francis or somebody and say, "Oh, but steroids." And meanwhile, when people ask me about adjustments I've made to our training, and the big aha moments that I had was I had to make adjustments to the idea that the kids I was working with, because they were weaker, and because they're weaker, so their outputs are so low. So their outputs aren't, to translate a typical West Side template over. Even for myself, I'm strong enough that I can induce fatigue on myself very easily. And then I'm old enough that my recovery will be significantly longer, right? So inducing the fatigue to get the response is not the hard part. It's managing my volume and frequency to recover. But then when I started working with kids, and especially younger kids, where they're so weak coming in, they can't within say like a 1 rep max, within lifting heavy. One of the early adjustments I had to make with them was that 1 rep maxes were not very effective. We still do low rep sets because we're trying to manage fatigue, but we would switch to a brief maximal tension system where there's more emphasis on maybe 3s and 5s, wherein what you're trying to get is on that last rep or two to get an effective load of tension to create the strain that a stronger lifter would have on a 1 rep max. And what this is to say is that you're having to almost artificially induce a level of fatigue to stimulate the adaptation in recognition of how weak the athlete is. So if I took Dave Hoff and I allowed him to take every performance drug in the world that he wanted, but I said, hey, you're going to do the workout that my high schoolers do, that my 9th and 10th graders do, and I want you to do it at the same relative percentages and speeds as them, it would break him in half because his outputs are so through the roof.
Yeah.
he would induce so much fatigue and stress upon his body. And at his older age, again, puberty is nature's steroid. So, when your kids are transitioning through puberty, they never recover faster than that. Everything after that, even when medically induced, is just trying to be reminiscent of it. So if you take an older, drugged up powerlifter and you try to put them on the programs that my 14 and 15-year-olds will smile and laugh while doing, and you say, do these same percentages, their outputs are so high it will break them. And if you switch the workouts the other way, those kids will just get bored because their relative outputs are so low. Well, when things are true, they repeat. So everyone who's afraid of names like Louis Simmons or Westside Barbell because of the implication of steroids will turn right around and say, well, we do a Clyde Hart track program. And we run astronomical volumes at intensities that don't make any sense. And Clyde Hart's not the only one with those kind of programs, but all of these systems that are born out of simultaneously a fear of steroids in the weight room, and then you go look at what they do on the track, and you go, well, wait a second. All of my kids have shin splints now. All of my kids are exhausted now. And you start to go through and you go wait a second. How much of these 80s and 90s sort of influenced track methodologies that we hear about, why is it that young kids with very low outputs and super fast, super high recoverability struggle to simply keep up with this? How is this possible? Moreover, how could older athletes with very high outputs have ever withstood this without needles?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I'll tell you this. I coach a kid that was elite, Marcellus Moore.
Mm-hmm.
He was 8th in Oregon last month, in the USATF.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he made the fast heat. That's he ran 9.96 this year, and he's only 5'6". So he was terrific. Now, in the summer,
I didn't realize he was that short.
Yeah, 5'6", 149 when he's broken the Illinois state record at 10:31 as a sophomore, as a 15-year-old sophomore wearing braces. So yeah, he's one of those guys, all good sprinters run tall. So he doesn't look as short until you get up next to him and say, man, you really are short. I think he lists himself as 5'7". So and he is bigger now. I think he weighs 165 or 170. Mm-hmm. He was jacked at 149. But in the summers, Marcellus would do feed the cat stuff for me. And he was extremely healthy as a freshman and sophomore. And in the summers, though, he ran AAU for an older guy, older than me. He'd had a lot of success because he would recruit the best athletes from 20 different schools to run on his summer track team. And, Marcellus was one of them, but they ran a lot of laps. And Marcellus was not as fast in the summer as he was in the spring, but they really felt like he was getting the endurance that was going to be required in college track and all that kind of stuff as well. And he withstood it very well. And I kind of learned from that really, really, really good athletes can do a lot of work and survive it. Whereas a 15-year-old typical athlete might break with that load. Now, I always preface that by saying, but wait, just because they can do it, should they do it? But the other thing I was thinking about what you're saying is that frequency of sprinting, I think I say twice a week, max speed, low dose, 3 times, most. Don't do it back to back. Maybe Monday, Wednesday, and Friday if you're trying to do a 5-day week. Having said that, that frequency might actually be too much as a sprinter becomes more elite. You
Mm-hmm.
know, maybe only once, and every sprinter is different. So maybe some people could do more, and then you have to ask, should they do more? But I think the times, and their health, and I think if you're
Mm-hmm.
open to learning, I think you'll know. Hey, I think he's better off. Chris Corfus had a guy that was not getting any better. He cut him down to no sprinting ever. He didn't
Mm-hmm.
sprint at all. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, he'd run on Saturday and PR. For that kid, for that kid,
Mm-hmm.
any sprinting was almost like too much. And you talk about letting the race be hard. That's letting the race be hard. I will also say that I have grandsons. They're like 6 and 8. They could sprint every day,
Mm-hmm.
and I think their times would not get slower or anything. I just think as you were saying, their outputs are low enough that they're not going to like burn up their CNS or anything like an elite sprinter might do.
Mm-hmm.
So so the amount of work is interesting, but even with those little kids, just because they're capable of doing it that much, I still wouldn't do it because I don't want them to get bored. I want
Mm-hmm.
them to look forward to the racing and timing and all the great things. So so you just got to be careful. And as you know, one of the biggest things about Feed the Cats is we're going to go low dose and we're going to perform in practice.
Mm-hmm.
Those things go together. By perform in practice, we're not jumping just to jump. We're jumping high.
Right.
I love the thing, put your hands high. Okay, they're high. Okay, now put them higher. You got a couple of extra inches. So we're always going after that extra. I say we want to do everything we do on old stereos I was fascinated with in the 70s. You could turn it up to 10. We want to turn everything to an 11.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you say, well, you can't do that though, right, coach? Some analytical kid. Actually, if if this is 10, that's 11. So we do strive to do things better than we've ever done it, which means we perform. And to me, performing in small doses in practice is the key to performing in a game.
Mm-hmm. 100% agree. Um, with 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 your system, how I have two things that came to mind there. One, I guess, is over the years. Um, so I've looked at again. I love looking at these like huge data sets to sort of find trends and see how kind of anecdotally it stacks up. Um, I graduated high school in 2005. Um, so relative to like Twitter, I'm kind of old, but relative to like the real world, I'm hoping at least that I'm very much not. Um, but I've noticed, just being in the weight room, and it makes sense when you look at all of the external factors. Um, I have a young daughter. I take her to the park, and we're often the only people at the park. Parks that I grew up playing at, and miles from my house where I'd ride my bike there, and you'd toss it aside into the woods when you got there, and you'd jump in whatever games were going on, and you'd ride back as the sun was setting, and my mom would yell at me that dinner was getting cold or something, and I'd just be out all day playing, and so would every other kid. We're drinking from hoses, we're jumping off of things. Kids are in casts all the time because they fell off a roof or did something stupid.
Hmm?
Um, but generally, the kids were very physical by comparison. They were also lighter by comparison. And all that led to kids having higher relative strengths. They're both absolutely stronger back then. Um, when I go back and look at just the weightlifting records locally 20 years ago in our high school competitions, third and fourth place teams would win, now.
Hmm.
Um, There simply are not kids are. It's far less frequent. The highest numbers are getting higher, but the average numbers are going down significantly. And even over looking at a combine data set, comparing the same combine service, a 16,000 player set and a 13,000 player set from 2013 to 2023, the average kid was a 20th of a second slower on average. They were 4 times more likely to run 6 seconds or higher. And
Mm.
yet they were 2.5 times more likely to run sub 4.5. So, records get broken every day. You look at the top of the podium, that's going up, up, up. But then you start to look down at like your district meet and you go, sixth place, like that kid wouldn't place at a JV meet back when I was growing up. And it's, I've literally gone back and looked at the newspaper clippings and stuff to be like, I'm not just romanticizing my own sort of era. Um, like these kids they're slower, they're weaker, just generally. They're in far worse sort of like general physical shape when they show up. Um, Over the years, have you made adjustments to your system because of that, or has that played into maybe some of the outcomes that you've come to down the stretch to realize like, oh, this is sort of an acknowledgement of what's happened to our kids versus what's been optimal all along?
There's kind of two different answers to that question. One is just the incredible, terrible situation with the youth of today, where they live indoor lives. They always have shoes on. They don't play. It's sad that high school kids don't drink as much anymore. I know that's a weird statement, but they don't hang out.
Yeah.
Drinking is down 50% in high school. And that's because kids don't leave their house anymore.
Hmm.
Back in the 70s, you weren't alive back then, but on every Friday and Saturday night, there'd be 50 cars at somebody's house whose parents weren't there. And
Hmm.
people got together, and there are none of those parties in my town anymore. And maybe that's a good thing. I'm not advocating teenage drinking. I'm just saying the kids just don't get out. And as you said, your best athletes are better, in my opinion. My best athletes were better than they were 30 years ago. Um, my my school relay records that I was on teams that broke, are those records are embarrassing in terms of today's sprinters. Having said that, there's this just weird, and of course I have to say something about PE. My son and his wife are both PE teachers, and my son has created a Feed the Cats curriculum,
Hmm.
in where they sprint and jump, and they gamify
Hmm.
everything, and guess what? The kids love it. The kids love
Yeah.
it. So first of all, I really like the idea of starting to teach athleticism at the youngest ages and feed the cats in a way that it's fun, low dose, highly gamified, all those kind of things. Record, rank, and publish. Kids get, even the slowest kid in the class quickly learns that as he gets faster, that's fun. That improvement is a fuel for future progress. Um, Having said that, have I adjusted my stuff? We sprint on day one. I don't put my kids through a conditioning test. Like, oh, and that gives me the shakes even saying conditioning test. But I don't do anything like, oh, you're not ready to sprint because you haven't been doing what that packet said to do over the summer. No way. We are treating everybody the same. And people say, well, don't people get hurt? I'm like, some really smart people, like Zach Dakant, one of my favorite people at
Hmm.
TCU. Uh, he says, if we did not ramp up into sprinting for 2 to 4 weeks, all my baseball players would pull hamstrings. And I'm thinking, probably right, because I kind of know what those guys do. Like lots of weight room, no sprinting. That's basically what they do. Uh, And he says, so you actually sprint on day one? I go, yeah, maybe because my kids are more resilient because they're
Hmm.
younger. Maybe it's because they have not been bodybuilding in the weight room 4 times a week like college baseball players probably do. So they don't have any of the tightness or muscle imbalances and all that kind of stuff. But we don't get hurt. And I think it goes back to dosage too. That they would get hurt if we did 10 200s,
Hmm.
but we don't do 10 200s. We do 3 time sprints. And if they don't feel 100%, they don't do three. I mean,
Hmm.
if a kid comes in and says, my shins are a little sore today, coach, I go, okay, I want you to go home and take a nap. Oh, no, they're not that bad. No, you need to go home because if you do that, they are going to be 100% tomorrow. And they hate, so they never tell me anymore. But the whole idea is that we do not sprint kids that are not healthy. And
Hmm.
I think we're teaching them something. When you shorten down practice and they love practice, maybe they can spend more time thinking about rest, recovery, sleep, nutrition. They can start thinking about the other details of being an athlete. And I think it's good for them.
Hmm. So with that, with my kids, again, sort of the conclusions of I usually don't give number one just for logistical reasons. Where our weight room is, I used to be at a school where the track was right outside of the weight room. I mean, it was right next to it. So when the kids would walk down this big hall or this big not hall, a big hill to come to the weight room, and it's Florida, it's hot, 3 o'clock. They're talking to girls in the parking lot, so everyone is excited, and the the arousal levels are high, and I had a kid who was the number one long jumper in the country that year, and he would come down, and there were days where I had a really fast freshman who had a phenomenal start, who uh, kept running a fast. Every time we timed, he would always run a faster 40. He just like much better acceleration. He didn't quite have the same top end speed, and he didn't have. The real big thing was he wasn't as confident of a kid, and he didn't have the same reaction time. So when they'd both be lined up in the 100, the senior who was the stud and is a D1 uh, athlete, he and the younger kid ended up being, I think, a D2 athlete now. Um, but the senior always beat him, and by a lot. And he was a kid who he dominated sort of his age bracket for the length of his career. Um, and eventually was 25.5 long jumper. Um, but the younger kid, he was like a 10-7 kid eventually. So he was at the local level, especially like he was good. He won. You knew like if one other kid wasn't showing up that he was going to win. Um, but when he was a little younger and he was like an 11-1, 11-2 kid, and the senior was like a 10-8 kid, because the 100 ultimately was not really his event. Um, Whenever they lined up against each other in competition, the senior would always win. But when we timed our 40s, he was always nearly a full tenth behind. And it was because at the time, like I didn't have an OVR sprint, so I couldn't run the lanes next to each other, so they couldn't actually race. So it was one kid came up when he raced, and one kid couldn't come up. He would be his outputs would be depressed when the stakes got high. His confidence was low in the moment. So when it was just him in his lane and he could zone everything else out, I'd say like you're the fastest kid in the world. Like unbelievable times. Um, but I would set up the lasers before they came down, and any day where they were out, before they even heard what the workout, I mean, like they'd throw off their backpacks, and it's Florida, so they're wearing shorts already. They would literally hop the fence down onto the track and talk crap to one another and say, all right, line them up. Like we're gonna see who, you say you can beat me, line them up. There'd be no warm up, and boom, they just go, and they'd run a 40 because that was what was out. And then our coaches would come out and say, like, well, what's the warm up gonna be? And I'd say, like, warm up, like these kids didn't even wait for the workout. He's already run 340s or 440s, like, um, so like my faster kids warm up. My slower kids do not warm up at all. Like it's hot and it's 3 o'clock and the bell just rang and the slow kids run. And the faster kids might kind of cruise through at 80% and then cruise through a little faster and cruise through. And then they'll come by and tell me like, all right, this one I'm going. What with Feed the Cats, what does your warm up look like? Do you have a real structured warm up? Is it kind of a la carte like that with your kids?
Yeah, it's I reference Zach Dakant again. He has a phrase that I love. I love phrases like this. He goes, "Our warm up is our workout. Our workout is our warm up."
Mm-hmm.
So to me, that means we hit the ground running. Going back to my dad as a basketball coach, you know how basketball players go out and shoot around, they're talking and stuff. And man, when Dad walked out and blew the whistle, we knew we were going to run Kansas, which was a full court. We're going to sprint. If people say, "Well, what was your warm up?" Our warm up was Kansas. We were going full speed. We did not stretch and pull our foot up to our waist and blah blah blah. Having said that, my kids do warm up for meets better than other schools, I believe. And that's because they understand that they would run a faster 10 or a faster 40 if they have sprinted before they sprint, which you kind of
Mm-hmm.
alluded to, like 80%, 90%, 98%. Okay, I'm ready. If you don't sprint before you sprint, your first race will be, I leave it
A
open,
race.
and your first race, the kids will say, will be our warm up. I go, yeah, and that's not good for our 4x1, right? So our kids understand, like in my atomic speed workout, which I wish I would have monetized it because it's just gone viral. I mean, everybody's doing my atomic speed workout. And all it is, I read the book by James Clear, Atomic Habits. And what
Mm-hmm.
are the smallest things? Atoms. What are really powerful things? Atoms. So we create a sprint habit by having the smallest workout possible, 15 minutes total. Hey, can you do 15 minutes twice a week? Kids I consult with are like, yeah, coach, easy. Okay. Oh, and by the way, you only have to do 60 seconds of work. 15 minutes, 60 seconds of work. You talk about two great hooks. And so they go out and do 10 speed drills in 10 minutes. There are things that everybody does. High knees, A skips, pogo jumps. We always jump like you do in small doses. We pogo, we tuck jump, and we bound every time. Those three things are part of our warm up, but that's also part of our workout. And then we do prime times. And then the last thing is acceleration into top speed, which that
Mm-hmm.
means you sprint before you sprint. And so as soon as that's over, actually we do RPR after the ninth one in season. But anyway, after those 10 are over, I say spike up, and Atomic Workout does 2 sprints instead of 3. That way we can keep it at 15 minutes. So that's what we do. And so when my kids get ready at a meet, I see them doing our speed drills. Sometimes I see them doing speed drills that we don't do. That's okay. Sometimes, but what I always see is they'll put their spikes on and do a high speed handoff, or put their spikes on and pretend to be doing a 10-yard fly. They want to feel themselves at top speed.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing we don't do, which was I was taught back in the 70s, you ran 2 laps. You
Mm-hmm.
ran 2 laps with all of your gear on so that you could sweat. Well, my guys haven't run a lap in 26 years. So unless they're at a meet and we're running the 4x4, then we're going to kick your ass. But anyway, that's the only time we run a lap is when we sprint a 400 and it hurts and stuff. But so we don't. I'm just not real big on warm up, and I think you kind of by doing that you kind of teach kids to be in a forever state of readiness, which I love.
Hmm.
Oh, and one other thing, you're talking about the kid that could win in practice but not in a meet. There's a huge thing that goes on in meets. It's called the spotlight effect, where there may be 18 people in the stands, but the kid feels like there's 2 million people, and it feels like there's a spotlight on them, and adrenaline is almost uncontrollable. That's why we do RPR, by the way, is
Hmm.
to lower that fight or flight or freeze syndrome. Fight, flight, freeze. And my favorite 3 words for a sprinter: let it rip. Let it rip. And if you're fight or flight, you can't let it rip. You got too
Hmm.
much shit going on. So one of the things that's really, really hard for new sprinters or young sprinters is that when they get in that race, they can't let it rip. They can't do it, and it's really hard to just free yourself. But that belly breathing and RPR stuff can really help.
Hmm. Um, so I guess as we, if you can't tell, I can talk. But quickly, I do these specifically on my phone because the battery is a natural limiter on how long I can go. While I have all this plugged in, I can't be charging it. Um, so we'll land the plane at some point here. But so one of the things that I get a lot of questions on, and again, I don't claim to run a feed the cats system. However, I do a lot of things that like I tell people like it's basically that like
Mm-hmm.
it's it and again sort of on the whole uh, I have a very large weight room emphasis, um, but a lot of the philosophical uh, points I think are very similar. One of the things that I started doing for logistical reasons. I get a ton of questions about like, do you do this or do you do this? And often I'm like, here's how I would say it optimally works. Here's how I would like to do it. Now here's how I do it because, uh, you know, in a very feed the cats kind of, reminiscent of like your story. At both schools that I started at, no one came. Like in week one, no one wanted to come. Like the biggest hurdle was that everyone had had a negative experience with the weight room. The coach would say like, "Hey, we're having conditioning," and I'd be like, "No, no, 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 don't tell them that. We want them to show up. Like, tell them that tell them we're going to get strong and fast in the weight room." Um, and like if you watch week one, school year, we're on our fourth week of the school year for us down here. I had a new team start with me. We had a coaching change. New team started with me, and I made a very big point of saying to him like, okay, now understand that like when you show up and you sit in the weight room with us, like this is what I want out of the kids. I was like, day one, we're gonna do 4 sets of box squats, and we're gonna jump. I was like, and what we actually did was add in some belted marching for the foot and ankle as well. But I was like, that might be the extent of that lower body workout for the next month. You might just see 3 things happen. And I was like, and your kids are going to have a lot of downtime. I'm going to yell at them about, hey, we need to take 5 to 6 minutes in between sets. And I said, so it's going to look like they're just dicking around for the better part of an hour. and it's going to look like very little is getting done. I was like, if you're going to show up and if we're going to do this, I want you to pay attention to the numbers week over week. And then on our upper body days, we would do some, again, we have a sidewalk outside of our weight room, and the track is like a quarter mile away. And I've got 200 kids and 3 sort of rolling hour groups. So I'm like, I get done with one group, and the next group is coming in. But what I started doing, and because of course the kids also don't come, it would be great if they all just showed up ready to go, laced up, dressed out, and showed up immediately like little robots, but that's not what happens. Someone moves their car, they get hungry and they go pick up a snack first or whatever. So that the big logistical hurdle is always, we only have so many racks. And when you get, sometimes 106 kids on 13 racks in a relatively small room, and we have squat racks that we move outside just to have enough space. And then on the sidewalks, we've got our lasers set up for usually 10-10 flies. And I've got a split calculator and stuff. So whether we do 10-10 flies or 20-10 flies, or, sometimes we'll go, if there's nothing on the sidewalk, we'll go up to like 60-yard lead-ins and have them sort of float and go. We'll do a lot of different variations, but most days it's just set up for 10-10 flies because that's what we have the space for when all the racks are moved outside. But so some of my kids will jump. I want all of my kids to jump on certain days before and after our workouts. And it's because the last thing, whether it's upper or lower body day, the last thing that I want to do is on our lower body days, we'll do like 2 minutes of belted marches, and then they'll jump. And if a kid is brand new with me, like a basketball player, tall, skinny, relatively good athlete, so they can kind of jump, but they're weak. They have no real work capacity. Let's say they jump 28 inches on the OVR jump, which would be like 31-ish on a just jump mat. At the end of the workout, an hour later, they might jump 25 inches, which would be like 28 inches on a just jump. Mm-hmm. So they go down 3 inches after doing a relatively light workout because they have no work capacity. They have no fitness for that. They have no conditioning per the task that we are doing. So you'll see this 3-inch drop. Meanwhile, another kid who's been there for 2 months, he'll jump essentially the same thing at the front and back. And then my kids who have been there for like 2 years, they'll jump 3 inches higher like clockwork at the end of the workout. The workout becomes the warm-up for the output. Mm-hmm. And on more of a delay, but the same thing starts to happen. My fastest kids started asking if they could run after the workout. Oh. And they started PRing. This doesn't happen often on our max fly work, but on our like 10-10s and 20-10s, my fastest kids typically run their fastest after, who have been with me for an extended period of time. But you can see as sort of the window of where they run best shifts from before the workout to squat and then go do it. Then it's like squat and do step-ups, then go do it. And then eventually one of the fastest kids that I've ever had, he ran 104 in a 10-10 fly. So that's on pace for a 4.47 type NFL Combine 40. So he's a quick kid. He'll be a D1 baseball player next fall. He always wanted to do like super heavy reverse lunges, do his squats and do his deadlifts, but he would even do Nordics before going to sprint. He wanted to feel everything, and he also had the conditioning to do that. That whole workout would just be his warm up, basically. He was a brutally strong kid for his size. But additionally, with that, sort of to that same like concept, like I said, like my fastest kids and just like my strongest kids need more time to warm up. You know, the 600-pound squatter, it might take him a full hour to do a heavy squat workout because he's like, I got to do 135 to just get everything moving. Then I got to start jumping plate by plate. Then I got to, take 8 minutes before that last set. And so naturally, just to get to his output, he has to go through a lot more volume on the front end. This was a similar thing. I put multiply powerlifting on ESPN in 2019, and that was the meet where in 4.5 hours, Dave Hoff broke the world record by 88 pounds. There was no classification of powerlifting in which anyone, had ever eclipsed that mark, and he broke his own world record by 88 pounds, which, would be like mathematically like the equivalent of Bolt coming out and just dropping a 9.4. So for him, he had to work on building the density within his workouts, like slowly teasing that density down over time. This is another thing where like his expectation of, he'll squat 1,100 pounds months out from a meet. He'll go like, oh, I'm in a great place. And you go like, what's your goal? And he's like, to squat 13. He's like, but I got 3 months to get there. I don't need to be there today. I got 3 months. And it's a conjugate system that he runs. So it's still like at those high intensities. So even while he's not like waving or periodizing his intensity up, the sort of paradigm shift that people are not aware of is he has to get his actual fitness to the point where he can express those outputs. So like he has to get to the point where he's 300 pounds with abs. And that's when he can handle but he doesn't, it's not that everything shifts. It's that just to accommodate what has to happen for him to do that, he has to build density slowly throughout, like there's no junk volume. It's just that everything starts to get a little tighter and a little more compressed. With your system, I'm not talking about like over a short period of time. I'm talking like a long arc, maybe over a full school year, maybe over several. Do you ultimately build either density or volume? Like, do you get to a point where, maybe if a kid's with you long enough, do you see, I guess, where kids start to get faster on going from their first to their second to their third rep? And then do you reach that point and then do you allow kids to go beyond that? If you have a kid who gets to like, let's take like Marcellus, would he get to a point where, say, a fourth or fifth rep would be fastest for him?
Sometimes. And I think one of the things I tell people, they say, how many sprints you do? And I say, I have 3. And they think that's like etched into stone or something. Remember, if a guy doesn't feel healthy, he doesn't run any.
Right.
And if Marcellus came out and ran, 099, 10 meter fly, 099, 098, 098, he'd say, F that. I'm going to run until I run a 095, and so throughout what you were talking about there, the C word kept blasting in my head, and it's not conditioning, it's capacity. And
Yes.
people say, well, isn't that the same thing? Well, it depends, because I still think of conditioning as bullshit, like the gassers and 40 minutes of stadium stairs and punishment running and things like that. So what happens is every kid that shows up for my track team will have a different capacity. And that capacity is basically how long they've been doing this. Do they play other sports? That type of thing. And most of my kids do play other sports. And that building a capacity is really what we're all about, but you cannot hurry that. I think
Right.
we're talking about building the capacity to perform, which
Mm-hmm.
was, and you have to grow that patiently, and it can be grown without doing a lot, or it can definitely be grown without doing any traditional aerobic conditioning. Now, this is a funny story. Cal Dietz, everybody knows Cal.
Mm-hmm.
I track football consortium. I think it was about 10 years ago. Cal gave a talk about aerobic conditioning for sports, and then mine was, like, fuck aerobic conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, maybe I shouldn't have scheduled mine right after his because everybody likes Cal. But honest to God, you'll love this, Michael. Everything he talked about was like aerobic conditioning by stacking performance level work.
Mm-hmm.
I said, Cal, how can you call that aerobic conditioning when we all know that aerobic conditioning is long, slow distance and trudging through multiple tempo runs and all that? He goes, because it is aerobic conditioning. We will have an aerobic effect. I said, by doing anaerobic work? I, I argued right there in front of, like 100 people. Aren't we just misnaming stuff here? That you're building capacity. He goes, oh no, we're building aerobic capacity too. And I'm like, maybe my stuff builds aerobic capacity by stacking performance level stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
so that capacity, if you hurry capacity, you'll end up with injuries.
Mm-hmm.
If you hurry capacity, you're just, I say the speed will grow like a tree. And so you cannot hurry the growth of a tree. You just keep doing it, keep jumping, keep lifting, keep bouncing, keep doing the things that sprinters do well and slow people don't do well. Keep doing those things. And and I never say trust the process, because way too many people that have bad processes say trust the
Mm-hmm.
process. And it's like throwing 12 eggs against the wall and picking up the one that didn't break and say, look, I've coached a national champion, and disregard the 11 kids you broke, and
Yeah.
left by the side of the road. So we do not break kids. We have a healthy lineup, and kids will patiently grow capacity. Marcellus Moore, who, I mean, people say, well, how in the world was he able to run 4 great races on the second day of the state track meet? 4 in the prelims, 4 in the finals. Did you ever work hard 2 days in a row? I said, hell no, never.
Mm-hmm.
We always high, low, or we just stay low until we do like a lactate workout or something. But he patiently built capacity by, I mean, he ran in 4 races in almost every meet. Uh, that will eventually build that capacity. And like you said, the kids that have been with you for a couple years, they're the kids that run the best at the end of the workout. The kids that are new, they don't have that capacity yet. And so they'll run their best at the start. But they still need, I hate to say volume, they need reps. I refuse
Yeah.
to say conditioning. I refuse to say
They
volume.
need opportunities.
They need reps at attempting performance level stuff. And even if they are less, they still got the reps, and they still have the intent
Mm-hmm.
to do things at a high level. And I just see in a performance based sport that that's how we get better, is by getting good at the things that matter and staying patient and not getting hurt.
Mm-hmm. All right. I love that. I talk about work capacity all the time. I got a phone call in the middle of that. So I love that you came back around to capacity there, because that's something that I always harp on, and again I say, like I don't do any conditioning. Our A few years ago, I had a volleyball team where um, this was in the middle of the summer. It was a time where just the schedules worked out that uh, we kind of had like an odd team out. We didn't have enough space within the weight room, and our volleyball team, who had done a 2 hour practice beforehand, um, they wanted to do, their summer conditioning, which was just what they called summer workouts, especially in girls' sports, because they don't, it's still relatively new to like get girls into a weight room and say that like, hey, we're going to do speed work with girls. We're going to actually get girls strong, not just like toned. We're going to actually attempt to like move the needle with our girls. That's still unfortunately like a new concept in a lot of places. And a few years ago, our volleyball team, again, we had studs. We had multiple D1 players, but we had this one day where simultaneously there was a D1 running back who was about to go off to school. He was sort of enjoying his last summer in Tallahassee, and he decided he was at the school. He had been working out separate from my groups, but he decided he was going to go get a little extra work in and talk to the volleyball girls. And they were uh, they were pulling sleds. Now, when we pull sleds, we have a bunch of old sleds that Florida State football has donated to us. They're like easily 100, 120 pounds. Don't know the exact weight on them. They're the kind that are designed for somebody to sit on top of the sled and somebody else to drive it like, they're uh, doing an offensive line drill or something. But I strap chains to the front of them and put belts on, and we just walk with them, long strides, kind of hooking the heel in and then pulling through the hamstring and then pushing off and getting, I want it to be hard enough that they feel all the way, from their glute all the way through their hamstring, and then towing off and getting that, what I call like a pedaling action through the foot, and driving off until you feel that those toes leave the ground. So it's purposefully that these are heavy enough that they are slowing you down to like a power walk at maximum. And they also have like places to load plates on. So I had a couple girls. One of my girls, she's at USF now. She had, I think, 3 45-pound plates on. And these girls, maybe a year earlier, had started with two trips with the empty sled. They'd go down 30 yards and come back 30 yards. And they'd go get water in between. And it's Florida, so it's super hot. It's 100+ degree heat index, blazing sun. There's no trees in this field. And it rains every day, so the field is kind of, wet and muddy in places. So the friction is, who knows how much these sleds actually weigh. They're heavy. But so the first time, the coach who was new with me said, all right, girls, we're gonna do conditioning. This coach also, she had won 5 straight state championships, and she was awesome. She's this woman. She had 5 straight state championships, and one of the there's 2 stories I want to tell here. But anyways, at one point, about a month in, she said how she liked what we were doing. She liked how she was seeing the girls go up and stuff. And she said, what can we do that would be better? And the girls had begged me that I noticed that they started jumping lower on certain days. And so I asked, like, what's going on? Y'all are all down like 4 or 5 inches. Said, oh, we had to do a conditioning run yesterday. And it was a day where they weren't with me. And I was like, oh, God, what is it? And they're like, it's a 2-mile run through the woods. And I was like, all right. And I said, like, unfortunately, I'm brand new and, I don't know your coach that well, but at some point we're going to address this. Don't worry. So a month goes by, and this woman who is, a Hall of Fame level coach, there are streets named after her and stuff. She's a big deal. And she comes up and she says, man, it's going so good. What are you seeing? And I said, well, about once a week, your girls come in and they're really down on their jumps. And she goes, oh, really? What could that be? And I said, well, sometimes when I see just one kid's down, I go, this is coming off of COVID still. So I was like, a lot of times when a kid's sick, like before you really see the symptoms, you'll notice that their jump starts going down. They're a little slower, just they're out of nowhere. And then suddenly the kid's absent for 3 days with the flu. I said, but when the whole team is going on, I said, like, have you been doing anything different in practice? And she goes, no, we didn't even practice that day. And I go, really? She said, yeah, we just did our 2 mile run. I said, oh. And she goes, was that bad? And I said, well, I'm not here to change your whole system or anything. And she goes, because I'd done that before with people and they don't ever take it really well.
No.
But she said, no, you can tell me. I said, okay, well, so every time I can pull up the, I pulled up the sheet and I said, like, I've got their best jump every day. And you can see, like, every day they're down like 15% the day or two after. And basically, like, the rest of the week, they're down. She goes, why is that? I said, well, because when you run that kind of volume, the first thing that's going to go is the elasticity and the strength in your foot and ankle. You're asking them to do tens of thousands of these very low output little impacts through their feet and ankles where they interact with the ground. And so you're telling them that that's a very important, threatening, stressful stimulus. So the body's going to listen, and it's going to give up its diametric opposite, which is to be very inefficient and punch the gas and burn lots of calories to get up off the ground fast, to be explosive just a couple times. I said, that's really hard to maintain. And she said, oh, really? And like basically within 10 minutes, she said, okay, so how often should I run them? I said, don't. And she said, ever? And I said, okay, how about this? On the day where you were going to do your 2 mile runs, come in during 7th period, we'll go to the track and we'll run fly 10s instead. And that's what we did. We ran 2 fly 10s the first day. And by the end of like the semester, they would sometimes run 5 or 6. But it would always be that like they'd be laughing and joking and, they'd never be complaining about it. And it slowly, just as that density built. And the result was just a few months later, they looked incredibly lean. They started looking, they started looking more like sprinters. A couple of the girls at 17 and 18 years old suddenly were an inch taller, which I've seen happen. I know one sprinter in particular who at 22 years old started training to be a pro sprinter after dabbling in CrossFit and powerlifting. And the next time I saw her, she was 2 inches taller at 22. And she's like, I don't know what happened. And I was like, I know what happened. You have microfractures in your shins from suddenly max velocity sprinting. Like you're slamming your feet into the ground and your body's responding by going like, oh crap, we got to get taller and longer. But same thing that happens like with the Maasai and tribes around the world that run a lot. They end up being taller. But as I was explaining this to her, so she dropped conditioning immediately. And I told her one day, I was like, that's really surprising that you did that. And she just held up her hand. And anytime we would have a similar conversation, she would hold up her hand anytime I seemed like reticent to tell her something. And she said, I had to make a change for every finger. No, because she had 5 state championship ranks. She said every single one came with a change. Said, so if I didn't change, I'd have nothing. And I also saw her get up in another coach's face who said, we've been doing this for, 20 years or something. She just went and walked off without saying a word. He had no idea what it meant. And I was like, that's the coldest thing I've ever seen. That was amazing. But anyways, they were doing their sled work. And what I would do is I would do this either with our jump device or with the Vertec. But they would do 3 reps of the 60 yards of the sled, and then they would jump. And when enough of them jumped PRs or close enough to PRs, I would add in another round of the sled. and they would be doing the sled at like a relatively conversational pace. Like it'd elevate their heart rate and they'd huff and puff a little bit, but they wouldn't. I would always shut it down before they really complained. And over month, we were just adding in a little bit of volume, but never if they complained and never if their jumps didn't go up. So it was only like if their jumps went down, we stayed there until the second round, their jumps went up. So on this particular day where the football player, a D1 running back, is with us and he's trying to flirt with my volleyball players, and they're just walking through the field. It's a heat index of about 114. It's blazing hot sun, and they've already done 2 hours of volleyball practice. 4 girls that day touched over 10 feet after their 4th round. So that was each round is 180 yards of walking with the sled in total. It's broken up into 3 reps, but this was in an hour. They did 720 yards of sled and did 4 rounds of jumping, and 4 of them went over 10 feet as a high school team. Almost every girl was within 1 inch of their PR. I think I had 2 other girls who were at 9'11". And the football player who had been doing, toughness, conditioning, like he had been doing his summer packet, and he hadn't trained with me for, a long time before that. He's been doing all this conditioning. He's been running hills, and he's been putting it, he's been logging a lot of volume and a lot of things where you knew and he knew and anyone watching knew that he was in the middle of his little Rocky montage. By the 3rd round, as the girls were talking about whose pool they were going to go to and whether they were going to Subway or Chipotle on the way home, he was literally on all 4s puking in the field because while he was doing all this work, he had developed no capacity for anything of a reasonable output. So he could do a ton of worthless nonsense. He could work for free and until the cows came home. But when it came time to do something in which you got paid, something of value, he had no capacity for anything. And so and meanwhile, these girls were literally they're complaining that they had to divert their sleds around where he was throwing up. So anyways, yeah, it's just that idea that to say that you don't do traditional aerobic conditioning does not mean by any stretch of the imagination that your athletes don't get conditioned or that they aren't conditioned. And also that idea of conditioning it should be at least that you are ultimately striving for a condition of peak performance. Mm-hmm. And that you're never, you're probably never going to get there. Kid's career is probably going to end for any number of reasons before he ever gets to a perfect condition for, for output. But that along the way, the same way that, you don't kill your kids in August when the playoffs are in November, that the practice shouldn't be harder than the meet, that all of this is this continuum where you acknowledge I'm where I'm at, and you acknowledge where you want to be, and you acknowledge that the road from A to B is long and winding, and that there aren't any shortcuts within it. And the discipline in getting there is often in, being disciplined enough as a coach to say, that's it. That's where we stop. Instilling the discipline to your athletes of, we're not just doing very little work. You're only getting so many opportunities to perform. So you have to pay attention and make the most of those limited opportunities, because that's what the game is going to be. Mm-hmm. That all of these things that are filled with a whole bunch of trigger words. This is also the sign that I should stop talking. My mouth just physically fails. But it's that all these trappings of arbitrary language that trigger and set off people into feeling defensive and whatnot. It's like it's all just language, and it's this reality of you're just sort of purposefully meandering towards your goal, an acknowledgement that there's not actually that many ways to ever reach your goal. There's a lot of ways to hype yourself up and tell yourself along the way in anticipation of failure, where you can look back and, like I said earlier with the kid whose dad said, like, I apologize for his genetics, but give him a good workout. You're just setting up like the excuse ahead of time to say, like, I know we're going to fail, so let's fail comfortably, saying that we did a lot of work. To tie this up, and then I'll shut up. Like Max Schmarzo, who I also like don't know, but I heard him say this thing one time, and I was like, that's incredible. He said, hard work is lazy. It's like, because it's something that everyone can do. And like the goal should never be to work hard. Like hard is inefficient. No business wants hard. No one, you're biologically programmed not to want hard. Sometimes you have to do hard because it's the only way that you know. But you're never supposed to settle with only knowing the worst way to do it. So anyways, all that said, where can people find... Thank you for coming on here so much, and hang on after I stop record so that we can go over house cleaning stuff. But thanks so much for coming on. What are you working on right now? What do you have out there? Where can people find you, support you? What projects are you excited about right now?
Right now, I'm actually wearing a USR shirt, Universal Speed Rating. I've been a partner with Les Bellman for about 3 years now, and I'm actually doing an 8-week master class. It's like an 8 1-hour presentations followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. And even though the deadline for buying a ticket has passed, because they're all recorded and you get all the recordings, you could contact USR and get involved with that. And even if you can't watch them live, it's a hell of a lot of content for $149, or it may be $199 now since the deadline's passed. So anyway, that's keeping me busy, because that's like a 60-minute presentation once a week. I have 2 podcasts: Sprint-Based Football podcast. I have the Feed the Cats podcast, and I just yesterday recorded a great session with Ben Patrick, knees over toes, and it was fascinating. It's the first time I've ever gotten to talk to him. That's the great thing about podcasts, is that we get a chance to talk to each other, and in the modern world we don't get that chance enough. So yeah, my podcast, my USR, and then I think we're doing a couple sprint-based football clinics after the New Year's. One's going to be in Georgia, I believe, right outside of Atlanta, and the other one, I'm not sure where the other one's going to be. I think we're going to do a sprint-based soccer clinic through Simply Faster.
Okay.
I think that's going to be
They
in
need
North Carolina. They need it, don't they?
Yeah.
They go, oh, it's all endurance. Oh, but wait, tell me about your best soccer player. Oh, well, she's fast and she's explosive. And I'm like, why aren't you training those things? Anyway, so yeah, I'm busy, and I'm doing. I just recorded some stuff yesterday. Since I'm retired from coaching now, I'm creating more content. So on my YouTube, and I don't have my password for most of my platforms. I run my own Twitter. My son Troy runs my other platforms. So he deals with all the incoming hate and stuff on Instagram. I don't ever see it, so that's nice.
All right. When my daughter gets old enough, I know what job she's going to get. All right. Well, that about does it, I guess. Like I said, Tony, hang on after the outro here. But thanks again. This has been another episode of the Burn the Ladders podcast. I will promise, and probably fail to say that I'm going to get more frequent with these things. I do have some more lined up for next week at least to record another one. I'll probably do another one myself talking about something in between. But thanks again to Tony. Go visit OVRperformance.com. Get yourself some affordable VBT, a jump device, maybe a broad jump mat. Go check out the Sprint. You've been hearing about Feed the Cats and talking about training speed. Go record, rank, and publish. I know we didn't say that enough earlier, but you can't do any of that until you have something that is actually going to quantify your efforts, which is the biggest cheat code for coaching. Kids listen to, quantifiable feedback so much better than they listen to you, and it helps them to buy into your message and to know that what you're saying actually works when you can give them strategies to succeed, and then they can see and acknowledge their own success. That's my favorite way to coach, and I think you'll enjoy it too. So anyways, this has been the Burn the Ladders podcast. Thanks again, and we're out.